How do you expose a friend who chose to let you die? I woke up to our fire alarm screaming at 3 a.m. and black smoke pouring in under our apartment door. My chest was already tightening because I have severe asthma that becomes life-threatening within 5 minutes. My best friend since middle school, Jenny, was already up and yanking open her closet. "Fire!" she shouted, pulling out this small red bag with 2 oxygen masks inside. She strapped one mask over her face, and I lifted my head expecting her to put the other onto me. Instead, she handed the second mask to the random guy she'd brought home from the bar last night. I watched in complete shock as they both adjusted their masks while the smoke got thicker around us. "Jenny," I wheezed, already feeling my airways closing up. "I can't breathe without one of those." She looked right through me like I wasn't even there, staring at something else. That's when she noticed our elderly neighbor's door hanging wide open across the hall. "Wait here," Jenny told the guy, and disappeared into the elderly lady's dark apartment, while I dropped to my knees in the hallway. The smoke was supposed to be lighter near the floor, but even down there my lungs felt like they were being crushed. I could taste the smoke in my mouth, acidic and thick, and I knew by my breathing I had at most 3 minutes left. Jenny came out of the old lady's apartment a minute later, her arms full of jewelry boxes belonging to the old lady. She literally stepped over me like I was a piece of trash on the ground, not her best friend dying right in front of her. My lips were tingling and numb now, which happens when you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain, and I remembered from my last ER visit that this meant I had 2 minutes before I passed out. "Jenny," I tried to say, but it came out as a rattling wheeze. "Shouldn't we help her?" the guy asked her, pointing at me while I tried to crawl toward the stairs. "She looks really bad." Jenny turned back and actually looked at me for the first time. That's when she did what by this point I never expected. She actually rushed over and started reaching her hand down to mine. My eyes burst open with gratitude. I started thinking maybe I could still live. I stretched my hand out to meet hers, looking at her with tears in my eyes. "Thank you," I weakly said, but my words were interrupted. Her boot knocked my hand back down to the floor. She kneeled down beside me, still keeping her boot pressed against my arm, and went through my pockets, grabbing my phone and my wallet. "You won't need this," she said, shoving it into her bag with the lady's jewelry. "Dead girls don't need money or to call 911. She hurried away from me and rushed down the stairwell, grabbing the guy's arm who decided to just follow her. I remember I started silently sobbing, my tears rolling but with not enough oxygen in my lungs to make a sound. I collapsed flat on my stomach. The floor was so hot my flesh was basically sizzling, and I started hoping I would just pass out and die that way so I wouldn't have to feel the pain of burning alive. To pour salt in the wound, I could hear Jenny down in the stairwell telling someone, "There's nobody else up there." I checked every hallway. Hearing that actually awakened something inside me. Despite the blisters now forming on my skin, I gathered every bit of strength I had left and started banging on the floor with my fist, hoping somehow someone would hear it and recognize me. My throat was so swollen it felt like someone had shoved a tennis ball down there, but I just kept banging. The floor beneath me was starting to creak as the fire ate through the apartment below us, and my hits were only making it worse. It could collapse any second and send me falling 6 stories down into a literal pit of fire. That's when I heard heavy footsteps and a deep voice calling out, "I hear banging! Is anybody up here?" "Fire department." I tried to bang on the floor again, but my hand wouldn't move anymore, and my vision was just pinpoints of light now. My consciousness started fading, and suddenly these huge arms were lifting me up. I wasn't sure who it was, whether I was dying or being saved. I just remembered the white light and serene feeling overcome my body. I don't know what happened next. All I know is that 3 days later I woke up in a hospital bed, with Jenny and a woman I didn't recognize sitting beside me. The woman was sobbing, but before I could ask who she was, the lead nurse came in. She had a very grim look on her face. She told me that the magic hands I felt lifting me back there were the hands of a 62-year-old firefighter. That man had saved me. But then while clearing out the other floors, the boards under his feet cracked, and he fell from a height of 50 feet, landing on his neck and losing his own life in the process. The woman here was his wife. I stretched my hand out to hold hers, wanting to tell her how her husband was a hero, but that's when Jenny interrupted me. "Oh my God, you're awake!" she cried, grabbing my hand away while the nurse was checking my IV. I thought I was going to lose my best friend forever. She was actually putting on a performance, turning to the woman and calling her husband the hero she will never forget. I took one look at her, and then the woman, and decided it was time for everyone to know the truth. I looked right at Jenny and then at the widow sitting next to her. My voice came out scratchy and rough but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's not what happened," I said. Jenny's face went totally white like all the blood just drained out of it. The nurse stopped messing with my IV line and her hands froze in place. The widow leaned forward in her chair and stared at me with this sudden sharp focus. I knew right then there was no going back from what I was about to say. The nurse asked me if I needed a minute to rest. I shook my head fast because I had to get this out now while there were people here to hear it, before Jenny could make up some other story or twist things around. Jenny started talking really fast about how scary the fire was and how confused I must be from breathing in all that smoke. Her voice had this fake worried sound that made my skin crawl. The widow's whole face changed from looking sad to looking really alert and focused. She turned to the nurse and asked her quietly but firmly to please stay in the room. My chest got tight just thinking about that night again. I told the widow about the red bag Jenny had in her closet with 2 oxygen masks inside. How Jenny put one mask on her own face and gave the second one to some random guy she brought home from the bar instead of giving it to me. The oxygen monitor next to my bed started beeping louder as my breathing got harder. But I kept going and described how I watched Jenny literally step over me while I was dying on the floor. The widow's hand grabbed the arm of her chair so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Tears started running down her face, but for totally different reasons than before. Jenny's whole fake act dropped instantly like someone flipped a switch. She stood up fast and her voice went cold and mean as she leaned down close to my hospital bed. "You're confused from the smoke and the medications," she said in this quiet hiss that only I could hear. "Think very carefully about what you're saying." Then she straightened back up and turned to the widow with this concerned expression on her face. She said really loudly that I was clearly not myself, and maybe the widow should give me some space to recover. The widow stood up right away and moved to block the door. Her voice was shaking, but she sounded determined when she asked the nurse to call hospital security and the police. Jenny tried to walk out anyway and said she needed to go get me some things from our apartment. But the nurse had already hit the call button on the wall. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 security guards in blue uniforms walked into my room. Jenny sat back down in her chair with this fake, worried look on her face. But her eyes were boring into me with pure hatred that made me want to look away. A doctor rushed in to check my vital signs because the oxygen monitor was still beeping from when I got upset. He looked at the numbers on the screen and explained that my lungs got really badly damaged in the fire. He said I needed to avoid any stress or talking too much for now. He set up a better oxygen delivery system with a mask that covered my nose and mouth. He told everyone in the room that I could only answer short questions for the next few days. The respiratory therapy was going to take weeks, and my ability to talk for long periods was pretty limited. That frustrated me so much because I had way more to say about what Jenny did. My phone buzzed on the little table next to my hospital bed. Jenny's eyes flicked to it and then back to me with this calculating look like she was planning something. The nurse picked up my phone and handed it to me. I saw 3 text messages from Jenny that she sent about an hour ago before she came to visit me. The texts talked about how we would get through this together and how she saved my life. My hands were shaking as I took screenshots of all 3 messages. I forwarded them to my email right away because I suddenly realized Jenny had been building up this whole fake story the entire time. The widow cleared her throat and everyone looked at her. She said her name was Margaret and asked if she and the hospital social worker could come back later to hear the full story from me. Her voice sounded raw from crying, but there was also this quiet strength underneath it. She told me her husband's name was Thomas and that he had 2 grown daughters who were adults now. I nodded my head and managed to whisper that I was so sorry. I told her that Thomas saved me when my best friend left me to die on the floor. Margaret's face kind of crumpled when I said that, but she reached over and squeezed my hand really tight before she walked out of the room. A police detective showed up less than an hour after Margaret left. He was professional, but seemed kind when he talked to me. He explained that because someone died in the fire, they were investigating everything really thoroughly. He told me these kinds of cases take a long time, and I shouldn't expect quick answers or results. He asked Jenny to wait in a different room while he took a first statement from me. I watched Jenny's face go through all these different expressions. First she looked scared and then angry, and then this weird calm came over her as she left the room. The detective pulled a chair close to my bed and got out a notebook. He gave me a different notebook and a pen, and asked me to write down everything I could remember while it was still fresh in my mind. He said even small details that seemed unimportant might matter later. I spent the next 2 hours filling up pages and pages with my shaky handwriting. I described the red bag and the 2 masks, and Jenny going into the neighbor's apartment across the hall. I wrote about the jewelry boxes and Jenny's boot pressing down on my arm, and her taking my phone and wallet from my pockets. My hands started cramping up really bad, and my chest hurt from the effort of sitting up and writing for so long. But I made myself document every single thing I could remember, because I knew memories fade over time and I needed to get this all recorded right now while it was clear in my head. The detective collected my notebook and told me to get some rest, because we would be doing this again in more detail soon. I barely slept that night because my mind kept replaying everything I had written down, making sure I hadn't forgotten any important details that might help prove what Jenny did. The next morning around 8, Margaret came back with a woman named Lucille, who introduced herself as the hospital social worker, assigned to help me with victim services and recovery planning. Margaret looked tired and her eyes were red from crying, but she sat down in the chair beside my bed and started telling me about Thomas. He had been a firefighter for 34 years, she said, and was supposed to retire in just 6 months so they could finally take that trip to Alaska they had been planning for years. Her voice stayed steady at first, but then it broke when she told me how Thomas always said the job was about giving people a chance to live their lives. And she looked right at me and said he gave me that chance with his last act. I started crying and so did Margaret, and we held hands across my hospital bed like 2 strangers who were now connected forever by the worst night of either of our lives. I felt this heavy weight settle into my chest that I recognized as survivor's guilt, knowing Thomas died so I could live while Jenny walked away without a scratch. But alongside that guilt was this fierce determination to honor Thomas by making sure everyone knew the truth about what happened, about the lie Jenny told that made him go back up those stairs. Lucille handed us both tissues and explained she would be helping coordinate my medical care, housing assistance, and connections to legal resources as the case moved forward. She gave me her card and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything or just needed someone to talk to who understood trauma recovery. Around noon, Detective Lewis came back, and I liked her right away, because she had this steady, calm way of talking that made me feel like she actually believed my story. She was maybe in her 40s with kind eyes and short dark hair, and she explained that she had been assigned as the lead investigator and would be working with the fire marshal's office to build a complete picture of what happened. She needed me to walk through everything again in much more detail for the official record, and she set up a recording device on the table beside my bed. I spent the entire afternoon giving my formal statement, starting from when the fire alarm woke me up at 3 in the morning. I described my asthma getting worse immediately, the red bag Jenny pulled from her closet, the 2 oxygen masks inside, watching Jenny put one mask on herself and hand the other to the guy from the bar. Detective Lewis took notes the whole time without any expression on her face that might make me feel judged or doubted, and she asked really specific questions about timing and the exact words people said. When I got to the part about Jenny stepping over me while I was dying on the floor, and then kneeling down to take my phone and wallet from my pockets, I saw the detective's expression get harder, and she underlined something in her notepad 3 times. I told her about hearing Jenny tell someone downstairs that she had checked every hallway, and there was nobody else up there, and how that lie almost cost me my life, because Thomas only came back because he heard me banging on the floor. The detective asked me to repeat certain parts multiple times, especially the timeline of when Jenny went into the neighbor's apartment and came out with jewelry boxes, and when exactly she took my phone and wallet. Detective Lewis asked if I could identify the guy Jenny brought home from the bar, and I had to admit I never actually met him or learned his name because Jenny just showed up with him in the middle of the night. I described what I could remember through all the smoke and panic, telling her he was tall with dark hair, probably in his late 20s, and he seemed really confused about what was happening around him. The detective nodded and made notes, then asked if I knew which bar Jenny went to that night. I gave her the name of the place 2 blocks from our apartment building, this dive bar called Rookies where Jenny hung out most weekends. Detective Lewis said she would start there and try to identify him through credit card records and security footage, and she seemed confident she could track him down within a few days. She explained that having a witness who wasn't emotionally involved would be really important for the case, especially someone who could confirm Jenny's actions and the things she said. The detective pulled out a stack of forms and explained I needed to sign releases allowing her to access the building's security footage, fire department records, and my complete medical charts from the emergency room and hospital stay. I signed everything without even reading it carefully because I wanted her to have access to any evidence that would prove what Jenny did. Detective Lewis told me she would be spending the next several days canvassing the bar, interviewing other residents from the building, and documenting all the physical evidence from the fire scene. She warned me this would take time and I should focus on recovering, but I almost laughed because how was I supposed to just recover when every single breath I took reminded me of Jenny leaving me to die on that floor? The detective must have seen something in my face because she reached over and squeezed my hand for just a second, then told me she believed me and she was going to build the strongest case possible. After Detective Lewis left, I remembered something I should have checked days ago. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and opened the Find My app that tracks device locations. Jenny's phone showed she was currently at her parents' house across town, which made sense since our apartment building was destroyed. But then I checked the location history and my stomach dropped. My phone had been at that same address yesterday morning, the day before Jenny brought it back to the hospital. I took screenshots of everything, my heart pounding so hard it made the monitor beep, because this proved Jenny took my phone and had it at her parents' house before bringing it back to make herself look good in front of everyone. I immediately forwarded all the screenshots to my email and then texted them to Detective Lewis with a message explaining what I had found. This was evidence that Jenny stole my phone and kept it for over a day before returning it, probably after she deleted anything incriminating or went through my messages. Lucille came back later that afternoon with copies of my medical chart notes from the emergency room, and I spent an hour reading through the clinical descriptions that made what happened feel even more real and terrifying. The notes described severe smoke inhalation, acute asthma exacerbation, second-degree burns on my stomach and arms from the hot floor, and dangerous oxygen deprivation that caused me to go into respiratory arrest. There was a section that said I was completely unresponsive when Thomas brought me out of the building, and paramedics had to resuscitate me in the ambulance using a bag valve mask and emergency medications. Reading those words made me realize how close I actually came to dying, like maybe 30 seconds closer, and I would have been gone before Thomas even found me. I asked Lucille to make extra copies of everything for Detective Lewis, because these records proved exactly how close I came to dying, while Jenny walked away without any injuries at all. The medical evidence showed I needed immediate help, and Jenny knew that when she left me on the floor. That evening my phone rang and I saw Margaret's name on the screen. She told me the Firefighters Union wanted to hold a memorial service for Thomas next week, and they asked if I would be willing to attend, or maybe say something during the service. The pressure of that responsibility made my chest feel tight, and I had to use my inhaler before I could even answer her. But I told her yes because Thomas died saving me, and the absolute least I could do was honor him publicly, and make sure people knew the truth about why he went back up to that 6th floor. Margaret warned me there would probably be media attention since Thomas was a decorated firefighter who died in the line of duty, and she asked if I was prepared for that kind of exposure. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure I was ready, but I would do it anyway because telling the truth mattered more than my comfort. About an hour later, the building manager called my hospital room to discuss insurance claims and temporary housing assistance. But he got really weird and evasive when I asked about the security camera footage and whether the fire alarm system had been working properly that night. He kept trying to redirect the conversation back to insurance paperwork, and finally admitted there might be some complications with the building's safety systems that were still under investigation. I told him Detective Lewis would be contacting him soon to get access to all the security footage and maintenance records, and his whole tone shifted to defensive. He started talking really fast about how the building met all code requirements, and they had done everything by the book, which made me suspicious about what else might have gone wrong that night besides Jenny's betrayal. I wrote down everything he said word for word, so I could tell Detective Lewis later. Before I went to sleep that night, I made the mistake of checking social media on my phone. Jenny had posted about the traumatic fire we survived together, with a photo of herself looking exhausted and brave outside the hospital. The caption talked about how grateful she was that we both made it out alive, and how she would never forget the heroes who responded that night. The comments were full of people calling her brave and asking if everyone was okay, and I felt physically sick reading all these lies. Several mutual friends texted me asking if I was all right and saying how lucky I was that Jenny got me out safely, and I wanted to scream the truth at all of them. But I remembered Detective Lewis warning me not to discuss the case publicly yet, because it could mess up the investigation. So I just turned off my phone and lay there in the dark, knowing Jenny was out there building this whole fake story about being a hero, while I had the truth documented in police statements and medical records. The next morning, I woke up with this burning need to say something publicly, even if I couldn't tell the whole truth yet. I grabbed my phone and opened Instagram, my fingers shaking as I typed out a careful statement. I wrote that I was recovering in the hospital and had given a full statement to police about what happened that night. I didn't mention Jenny by name or include any specific details about what she did. I just said the investigation was ongoing and I was grateful to the firefighter who saved my life. Every word felt restrained and factual, like I was holding back a scream. It took everything in me not to expose Jenny's lies right there in that post, but I trusted Detective Lewis's advice about not messing up the investigation. I hit post and watched the comments start rolling in immediately, people sending prayers and asking what happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Lewis about an hour later. She said she had obtained the list of security cameras in the building's stairwells and common areas. The building manager was required to turn over all footage from that night, though he apparently tried to claim some cameras weren't working. She told me she would be reviewing everything over the next few days and would let me know what she found. I felt this surge of hope reading her message because video evidence couldn't lie the way Jenny did. 2 days passed with me stuck in that hospital bed doing breathing exercises and physical therapy. Then Detective Lewis called with news that made my blood run cold. The 911 dispatch audio included Jenny's voice clearly stating that there was nobody else up there, and she had checked every hallway. She said this when she reached the ground floor while I was dying 6 floors above her. The recording was time-stamped and proved Jenny lied directly to emergency responders. I could barely breathe as the detective played me the clip over the phone. Hearing Jenny's voice so calm and certain while I was banging on the floor with the last of my strength made me want to throw up. That night, I finally checked my bank account and credit card statements, something I should have done way sooner. There were 3 tap-to-pay charges at a 24-hour convenience store made at 4:47 a.m. on the night of the fire. That was right after Jenny would have gotten out of the building. My wallet was in my pocket when Jenny took it from me, and she used my card while I was being brought back to life in an ambulance. The rage I felt was almost as bad as the smoke had been in my lungs. Detective Lewis showed up the next morning with more evidence that made me feel sick. She had security footage from the convenience store showing Jenny clearly in the same clothes from the fire. Jenny was buying bottled water and snacks while carrying the red bag and what looked like jewelry boxes. The detective had already pulled the transaction records that matched my credit card. Jenny's face was clearly visible in multiple camera angles on the tablet screen. I watched the footage and felt this wave of nausea seeing Jenny so calm and collected, just an hour after leaving me to die on that hallway floor. The detective sat down in the chair beside my bed and explained she was working on finding out who the guy from the bar was through credit card records. She was also talking to staff who worked that night at the bar. She told me she was working with the fire marshal about the building's safety systems and Thomas's death. She reminded me that building a solid case takes time and I needed to be patient. That was really hard to hear when I was stuck in a hospital bed with nothing to do but think about Jenny's betrayal over and over. My lung doctor came in during morning rounds and delivered news that crushed me. My lung function was way down, and I had problems that would need months of therapy as an outpatient. I couldn't return to work or school for at least 6 weeks minimum. Any future smoke could be deadly for me now. The doctor was gentle but firm about the permanent damage to my lungs. I felt my freedom slipping away along with my sense of safety in the world. My phone buzzed that afternoon with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was this weird mix of threat and bribe that made my hands shake. Jenny said she was sorry if she remembered some things wrong and offered to help with my medical bills if I didn't make this into something it wasn't. I took a screenshot immediately and forwarded it to Detective Lewis without typing any response back. My hands were shaking with anger at Jenny thinking she could buy me off or scare me into silence. Detective Lewis called me later that day with an update about Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor from across the hall. Mrs. Chen had filed an official police report about her missing jewelry. These were family treasures worth thousands of dollars that were taken from her apartment during the fire. The detective told me this made the case stronger because it showed Jenny's stealing wasn't just against me but a pattern of behavior. I felt guilty that Mrs. Chen lost precious items because Jenny saw a chance to steal while people were running for their lives. 2 weeks after the fire, Detective Lewis identified the bar guy as Lincoln York through credit card records from that night. She interviewed him and called me afterward to say he confirmed everything I had told her. Jenny gave him the second mask and they both knew I was in trouble. He heard Jenny tell someone downstairs that she had checked all the floors. Lincoln seemed really shaken about what happened and willing to help with the investigation. That was a relief because I was worried he might lie to protect Jenny or himself. Detective Lewis called me the next morning with news that made my chest feel lighter for the first time in days. Lincoln had come to the police station voluntarily and given a full formal statement about everything he saw that night. The detective read parts of it to me over the phone, and hearing Lincoln's words describe exactly what I remembered felt like someone was finally believing me after days of feeling crazy. He told the detective that Jenny handed him the oxygen mask while I was on the floor struggling to breathe, and he could see I was in bad shape even through the smoke. Lincoln admitted he asked Jenny if we should help me, and she told him I would be fine and they needed to get out right away. His statement included the part about Jenny going into Mrs. Chen's apartment and coming out carrying jewelry boxes, which he said seemed weird, but he was too scared and drunk to question it at the time. Detective Lewis told me Lincoln's account matched mine down to specific details like the red bag, and Jenny stepping over me in the hallway and having an independent witness who had no reason to lie made the case much stronger. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, because part of me had been terrified that Lincoln would claim he didn't remember anything, or would back up whatever story Jenny told. The detective said Lincoln seemed genuinely sorry about not doing more to help me, and while that didn't excuse his actions, at least he was taking responsibility now by telling the truth. Detective Lewis arrived at my hospital room that afternoon with a thick file folder, and the serious look on her face told me she had found something important. She sat down in the chair next to my bed and opened the fire marshal's official report, flipping to a section with highlighted text. The report included radio communications from that night, and the detective had found a transmission where Thomas reported hearing faint banging on the 6th floor, after Jenny had already told everyone downstairs that the floor was clear. The timestamp showed Thomas went back up specifically because he heard me trying to signal for help, and he found me within 2 minutes of that radio call. My hands started shaking as Detective Lewis showed me the timeline laid out in the report, because it proved that Thomas died going back for me after Jenny lied about checking all the hallways. The report also confirmed that the floor collapsed under Thomas while he was clearing other apartments on lower floors, and he fell through to the ground level where he died right away from the impact to his neck. Seeing it all written out in official documents made Thomas's sacrifice feel even heavier, and I had to use my inhaler because my breathing got tight. Detective Lewis gave me a minute to collect myself, then told me this evidence was huge because it showed a direct connection between Jenny's lie and Thomas going back into a dangerous situation. The radio transmission proved Jenny knew she was giving false information to first responders, which made her obstruction charge much more serious. Lucille knocked on my door later that day with a folder of papers and a kind but firm expression. She sat down and told me she had scheduled my first appointment with Callista, a therapist who works with people dealing with survivor guilt and betrayal by people they trusted. The intake session was set for next week, and Lucille explained that what I went through with Jenny plus Thomas dying to save me was too much for anyone to process alone. I felt myself getting defensive because therapy felt like admitting I was broken or couldn't handle things on my own. Lucille must have seen the resistance on my face because she gently pointed out that surviving something like this would break anyone, and getting help was just smart maintenance, not weakness. She compared it to physical therapy for my lungs, saying my mind needed the same kind of professional care to heal properly. I finally agreed to go, even though the idea of talking about everything that happened made me feel exhausted. Lucille squeezed my hand and told me Callista was really good at helping people work through complex feelings about being saved while someone else died, which was exactly what I was struggling with every time I thought about Thomas. The next afternoon, I was dozing in my hospital bed when I heard raised voices in the hallway outside my room. My eyes snapped open, and my heart started racing, because I recognized Jenny's voice getting louder and more aggressive. She was telling the floor nurse that she was my emergency contact and had a right to see me, and the nurse was calmly explaining that I had specifically requested no visitors except approved people. Jenny's voice got sharper, demanding to know what lies I had been telling about her and insisting she saved my life. I pressed the call button with shaking hands, and within seconds 2 security guards appeared in the hallway. Through my partially open door, I could see Jenny's face twisted with anger as she shouted about how ungrateful I was and how she risked her life to get me out of that building. The security guards took her by the arms and started walking her toward the elevators, but she kept yelling back toward my room about how I was making everything up, and she would prove I was lying. My whole body was shaking so hard the bed was moving and my oxygen monitor started beeping as my breathing got rapid and shallow. A nurse rushed in and gave me anti-anxiety medication through my IV, while talking to me in a soothing voice, telling me Jenny was gone and security had escorted her out of the building. It took almost 20 minutes for my breathing to calm down enough that the monitor stopped alarming, and even then I felt jittery and scared. Detective Lewis showed up within an hour of the hospital incident, and she looked angry in a controlled, professional way. She sat down and told me we were filing for a temporary protective order against Jenny right now, based on both the threatening text message and her showing up at the hospital to harass me. We went before a judge that same afternoon, with me in a wheelchair because I was still too shaky to walk far. Detective Lewis presented the evidence, including the text message screenshot, the hospital security report, and witness statements from the nurses who heard Jenny's threats. The judge reviewed everything with a serious expression, then granted the protective order right away without even asking many questions. The order required Jenny to stay at least 500 feet away from me, the hospital, and any place where I was living. It was good for 2 weeks with a hearing scheduled to extend it if needed, and having that legal barrier between us made me feel like I could breathe a little easier. The judge also added a note that any violation would result in immediate arrest, which Detective Lewis said was because of Jenny's aggressive behavior at the hospital. Margaret called me that evening, her voice warm but sad over the phone. She asked if I felt strong enough to speak briefly at Thomas's memorial service planned for 2 weeks from now, and explained that the media interest had grown because Thomas was a decorated firefighter who died in the line of duty. Margaret wanted to make sure his sacrifice was honored truthfully, and she thought having me there would help people understand why he went back up to that 6th floor. I told her I would do it even though the thought of public speaking while still recovering made my stomach twist with anxiety, because Thomas deserved to have the truth told about what really happened. Margaret's voice broke a little as she thanked me, and she promised she would be right there with me the whole time. The next morning, Detective Lewis called with information about a separate investigation that was opening up. Basil Green, the fire inspector, had contacted her with early findings that the building had multiple code problems, including smoke detectors that didn't work on several floors, and a sprinkler system that wasn't taken care of properly. He was flagging possible criminal charges against the building owner and management company for ignoring safety rules, which meant this was becoming a much bigger case than just Jenny's actions. Detective Lewis told me this might mean Thomas's death could have been stopped if the building had proper safety systems working that night. I felt this sick anger in my stomach thinking about how many things went wrong that night, from Jenny's betrayal to the building's broken safety equipment. The detective said the fire inspector's findings would be part of the official report and might lead to separate charges against the building owners. A week after Lincoln's first statement, Detective Lewis told me he had come back to sign a sworn statement at the police station. She said he was helpful and seemed really sorry about not doing more to help me that night. Lincoln admitted he was drunk and scared and just followed Jenny's lead, which didn't make what he did okay, but at least showed he was taking responsibility now. His sworn statement gave crucial backup for the timeline and Jenny's specific actions, and the detective explained that having an independent witness who wasn't connected to either of us made the case much stronger. Detective Lewis said Lincoln's statement would be important if this went to trial, because he could describe exactly what Jenny said and did without any bias. I felt grateful that Lincoln was being honest now, even though I was still mad that he walked past me while I was dying on that floor. Detective Lewis came to my hospital room a few days later with her laptop and a look of satisfaction on her face. She had gotten a warrant for Jenny's phone records and location data, and the information that came back created a clear trail of Jenny's movements after the fire. The data showed Jenny's phone was at her parents' house the morning after the fire, then at a pawn shop across town that afternoon, before coming back to the hospital area. Detective Lewis pulled up a map on her laptop showing the exact route and timing, and it matched perfectly with where my stolen stuff and Mrs. Chen's jewelry probably ended up. The detective was building a timeline that was becoming harder and harder for Jenny to explain away, with her phone putting her at specific locations at specific times. She showed me how the location data proved Jenny went straight to her parents' house instead of staying at the hospital with me, then made a trip to the pawn shop before coming back to play the concerned best friend. The final piece of evidence hit me like a punch to the stomach, even though I knew it was coming. The pawn shop owner had provided security footage showing Jenny selling several pieces of jewelry that matched Mrs. Chen's description of her stolen family treasures. Detective Lewis played the video on her laptop and Jenny's face was completely clear in multiple camera angles. She looked calm and normal, chatting with the pawn shop guy like she was just doing regular business, not selling stolen property from an old lady who barely escaped a fire. The pawn shop owner had Jenny's driver's license information because shops are required by law to record and report those transactions to police. I watched the footage with this sick feeling in my stomach, seeing Jenny so relaxed less than 24 hours after leaving me to die on that hallway floor. Detective Lewis paused the video on a clear shot of Jenny's face and told me this evidence was solid because there was no way to deny it was her or claim someone else sold the jewelry. A few days later, Detective Lewis asked me to come to the police station for a conversation about where the case was heading, and I took the bus there with my portable inhaler in my pocket. She sat me down in a small meeting room with a table covered in folders and documents, and her expression was serious but kind. The detective started by explaining that building a criminal case takes months, not weeks, and even with all the strong evidence we had collected, there were no guarantees about what would happen in court. She told me that proving Jenny's intent was going to be the biggest challenge because defense lawyers are really good at creating reasonable doubt in jurors' minds. I appreciated that she wasn't giving me false hope or making promises she couldn't keep, and she made it clear that what Jenny did was serious and criminal, even if the legal process was slow and frustrating. Detective Lewis pulled out a legal pad and started outlining the potential charges she was working on with the DA's office. The first charge was larceny for stealing my phone, my wallet, and Mrs. Chen's jewelry, which was the easiest one to prove because we had video evidence and recovered property. The second charge was obstruction of justice for lying to emergency responders when she told them she had checked all the floors and nobody was up there. The third charge was reckless endangerment for abandoning me in a life-threatening situation when she knew I had severe asthma and would die without help. She explained that the reckless endangerment charge was the hardest one to make stick, because it required proving that Jenny knew I would die without assistance and consciously chose to withhold aid. The legal standards were really high, and I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that not all the charges would work out in court. Detective Lewis showed me case law examples where similar charges had failed because defense attorneys argued their clients didn't fully understand the danger or didn't have a legal duty to help. I felt frustrated hearing this because it seemed obvious that Jenny knew exactly what she was doing, but the detective reminded me that obvious and legally provable were two different things. She told me the DA was confident about the larceny and obstruction charges, but the endangerment charge might get dropped or reduced as part of a plea deal. I left the police station feeling heavy with the reality that justice wasn't going to be as clear-cut as I wanted it to be. Over the next 3 days, I worked on writing my memorial remarks for Thomas, sitting at my small temporary apartment desk with a notebook and pen. I wanted to honor his sacrifice and tell the truth about why he had to come back for me, but I also didn't want to make his memorial service about Jenny's betrayal. I wrote and crossed out and rewrote dozens of versions, trying to find the right balance between honesty and respect. I focused on Thomas's bravery and the fact that he heard me banging on the floor when someone else had told firefighters that nobody was up there. I described how he trusted his instincts and came back to save me even though he'd been told the floor was clear. I didn't name Jenny directly in the remarks, but anyone who knew about the case would understand what I was saying. Margaret called me on the third evening, and I read her my draft over the phone, my voice shaking as I got to the part about Thomas hearing me when I'd been left behind. She cried quietly on the other end of the line, and when I finished reading, she told me it was perfect, and exactly what Thomas would have wanted. She said he always believed in telling the truth with dignity, and my remarks honored both his sacrifice and his character. I felt relieved that Margaret approved because her opinion mattered more to me than anyone else's. The day after I finished the memorial remarks, I started seeing posts on social media from Jenny's friends attacking me. The protective order had become public record when it was filed with the court, and apparently that triggered a whole harassment campaign. Jenny's college roommate posted a long rant about how I was lying and trying to destroy Jenny's life for attention, and the comments under her post got really nasty. People I'd never met were calling me ungrateful and crazy, saying I was making up stories because I was jealous of Jenny or wanted sympathy. Several people tagged me directly in posts about false accusations and how they ruin innocent people's lives. I felt sick reading through all the comments, but I forced myself to document everything by taking screenshots of each post and comment. I created a folder on my phone specifically for the harassment evidence and forwarded everything to Detective Lewis. She called me back within an hour and told me that some of the accounts looked suspicious, possibly fake profiles that Jenny herself might be using to get around the protective order. If we could prove Jenny was behind any of the fake accounts, it would be a violation of the court order and could get her in more trouble. The detective told me to keep documenting, but not to respond to any of the posts, because engaging would only make things worse. My first therapy appointment with Callista was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I showed up at her office feeling nervous and defensive. Lucille had recommended her as someone who specialized in trauma from betrayal, and the office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Callista was in her 40s with a calm presence, and she started the session by asking me to talk about my friendship with Jenny before the fire. I didn't expect that question because I thought we'd focus on the fire itself, but Callista explained that understanding the relationship history was important for processing what happened. We talked about patterns I'd ignored over the years, like how Jenny always seemed to prioritize herself in situations where we both needed something. I remembered times when Jenny had lied to avoid getting in trouble, or moments when she'd been selfish in ways I'd excused as just her personality. Callista asked me specific questions about whether Jenny had ever put her needs above mine in dangerous or important situations, and as I answered, I started seeing a pattern I'd missed before. She gently suggested that Jenny's actions during the fire weren't completely out of character, but rather an extreme version of who she'd always been when faced with a choice between herself and others. That realization hit me harder than I expected because it meant I'd missed so many warning signs over the years. I'd excused Jenny's selfishness as minor flaws instead of seeing them as core parts of her character. The session left me feeling raw and exposed, like I'd been fooling myself about who my best friend really was for most of my life. 3 weeks after the fire, I got a call from the DA's office asking me to come in for a meeting about moving forward with charges. I took another bus ride downtown and met with a woman who introduced herself as a victim advocate working with the prosecutor. She explained that they were officially moving forward with criminal charges against Jenny and needed my consent to release my medical records as evidence. The advocate walked me through what would be required if the case went to trial, and the list was overwhelming. I would have to testify in court and answer questions from both the prosecutor and Jenny's defense attorney. The defense attorney would try to poke holes in my story and make me look unreliable or confused. There would probably be media attention because of Thomas's death, and reporters might try to contact me for interviews. Every detail of that night would be picked apart and analyzed by lawyers trying to win their case. The advocate showed me a stack of consent forms that would allow the DA to access my medical charts, my therapy records, and my hospital treatment notes. Signing those forms meant giving up my privacy and letting strangers examine the most vulnerable moments of my life. I sat there looking at the papers and feeling sick about how invasive the whole process was going to be. But then I thought about Jenny walking free with no consequences for leaving me to die and stealing from Mrs. Chen, and I picked up the pen. I signed every single consent form because the alternative was letting Jenny get away with everything she'd done. The next major development came when Detective Lewis called to tell me that police had executed a search warrant on Jenny's parents' house, where she'd been staying since the fire. They recovered several pieces of Mrs. Chen's jewelry that hadn't been pawned yet, hidden in a jewelry box in Jenny's childhood bedroom. They also found my empty wallet stuffed in a bathroom drawer, which was such a stupid place to hide evidence that it almost made me laugh. But the most shocking discovery was the red bag with the 2 oxygen masks, which Jenny had apparently kept instead of throwing away. Detective Lewis said it looked like Jenny had kept the bag as either a trophy or some kind of insurance, maybe thinking she could use it to prove she'd tried to help me if anyone questioned her story. The physical evidence kept piling up, and I felt this grim satisfaction knowing that Jenny's careful lies were falling apart. Every item the police recovered was another piece of proof that I'd been telling the truth about what happened that night. Detective Lewis told me the search warrant findings would be really important for the trial, because they showed consciousness of guilt, which meant Jenny knew she'd done something wrong and tried to hide the evidence. The morning of Thomas's memorial service arrived, and I was a complete nervous wreck despite taking the anti-anxiety medication Callista had prescribed. I had a portable oxygen tank with me just in case my breathing got bad, and Lucille had agreed to come with me for support. I got dressed in the only black dress I owned, which I'd bought at a thrift store because all my clothes had burned in the fire. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble with the zipper, and I kept my inhaler in my dress pocket where I could reach it easily. Lucille picked me up in her car, and we drove to the church where the service was being held. The parking lot was packed with cars, and I could see firefighters in their dress uniforms standing outside the entrance. My chest felt tight just looking at the crowd, and I had to use my inhaler before we even got out of the car. Margaret was waiting near the church entrance, and she came over to hug me as soon as she saw us. Her hug felt like both a welcome and a shared burden, and I could feel her shaking slightly as she held me. She whispered thank you in my ear, and then led us inside to show us where we'd be sitting. Before the service officially started, Margaret asked if we could have a private moment in a side room off the main chapel. Lucille waited outside while Margaret and I sat down on a small couch in the quiet room. Margaret's hands were twisted together in her lap, and her eyes were red from crying. She told me she needed to hear the full truth about what happened that night, even though she knew it would hurt to hear it. I took a deep breath and told her everything, starting with the 2 oxygen masks, and Jenny's choice to give the second one to Lincoln instead of me. I described how Jenny went into Mrs. Chen's apartment and came out with jewelry boxes while I was dying on the floor. I told her about Jenny's lie to the firefighters, saying she'd checked all the floors and nobody was up there. I explained how I'd used my last bit of strength to bang on the floor, hoping someone would hear me, and how Thomas had heard that banging and come back for me. Margaret cried while I talked, and she reached over to hold my hand so tight it almost hurt. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute before she spoke. She told me that knowing Thomas died saving someone who had been deliberately abandoned made his sacrifice even more meaningful to her. He was the kind of man who couldn't walk away from someone in need, even when others did, and that's exactly who he'd been his whole life. She said she was grateful I was telling the truth because Thomas deserved to have people know why he went back up to that 6th floor. The memorial service started, and I sat in the front section with Margaret's family and the other firefighters who'd been close to Thomas. The church was completely packed with people standing in the back because there weren't enough seats. I kept my hands folded in my lap to hide how badly they were shaking, and I focused on my breathing to stay calm. Several people spoke before it was my turn, including Thomas's fire chief and his 2 daughters. When Margaret nodded at me that it was time, I walked up to the podium with my printed remarks in my shaking hands. My voice came out shaky but clear as I started talking about how Thomas heard me when I'd been left behind. I described the banging on the floor, and how someone had told firefighters that nobody else was up there, but Thomas trusted his instincts and came back anyway. I talked about how he gave his life to give me mine, and how his sacrifice meant I had a responsibility to tell the truth about what happened. I didn't name Jenny directly, but everyone in that room who knew about the case understood exactly what I was saying. The room was completely silent except for quiet crying, and I could see several firefighters wiping their eyes. When I finished my remarks and walked back to my seat, multiple firefighters nodded at me with expressions that mixed respect and grief. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand so tight it hurt, but I squeezed back just as hard because we both needed that physical connection to get through the moment. I woke up the next morning to my phone buzzing with notifications, and when I opened social media, I saw my name everywhere. Local news sites had picked up the memorial story with headlines like, "Fire survivor reveals lie that nearly cost her life," and "Firefighter's death, linked to false safety report." The comment sections were brutal and split almost down the middle. Some people were posting things like, "This is horrifying, that woman should be in jail," and "Thank God for that brave firefighter who didn't believe the lie." But just as many were attacking me with comments saying, "Using a funeral to attack someone is disgusting," and "She's clearly traumatized and confused, this isn't fair to her friend." I read through maybe 50 comments before my hands started shaking so badly I had to put the phone down. Someone had posted a photo of Jenny from before the fire, smiling and looking innocent, with a caption about how I was destroying her life for attention. Another person wrote a whole paragraph about how smoke inhalation causes memory problems, and I probably didn't remember things correctly. I felt sick to my stomach and wanted to respond to every single lie, but Detective Lewis had warned me about engaging with social media during an active investigation. I took a screenshot of the worst comments and sent them to the detective, then forced myself to close all the apps before I made things worse by responding. Detective Lewis called me that afternoon and told me not to read the comments anymore, that public attention was a double-edged sword, but the pressure might actually help push the DA's office to take the case seriously. She said prosecutors pay attention to community response, and the fact that people were talking about it meant they couldn't just quietly drop the charges. That made me feel slightly better, but I still couldn't stop thinking about all those people who thought I was lying or using Thomas's death for some kind of revenge plot against Jenny. 4 weeks after the fire, I was sitting in my temporary hospital room doing breathing exercises when Detective Lewis called with news that made my heart race. Jenny had been formally charged with larceny, obstruction of justice, and reckless endangerment, and she was turning herself in that morning. I immediately turned on the local news channel and watched the live coverage of the police station entrance. The camera showed Jenny arriving with her lawyer, wearing a nice dress and looking scared but composed. She was inside for maybe 3 hours before they walked her back out, and I watched her get processed and released on bail the same day. The whole thing felt wrong, seeing her just walk away like nothing had happened. Her lawyer started giving interviews right there on the police station steps, saying Jenny was the victim of a misunderstanding and that I was traumatized and confused. He kept using words like tragic situation and unfortunate miscommunication, like Jenny hadn't deliberately left me to die and stolen from 2 people during a fire. I was sitting there alone in my hospital room, watching Jenny walk free on the news, and I wanted to scream so badly my throat hurt. Detective Lewis called me back an hour later, and I asked her why Jenny got to just leave on bail after everything she did. The detective's voice was patient, but firm as she reminded me this was just the beginning of the legal process, that bail doesn't mean someone is getting away with anything. She explained that most people charged with nonviolent crimes get bail, and we needed to focus on building the strongest case possible for trial. I understood what she was saying, but it still felt like a punch in the gut watching Jenny walk out of that police station while Thomas was dead, and I was still stuck in a hospital bed with damaged lungs. The building management company called me 2 days later with an offer of temporary housing assistance while I recovered. They were moving me out of the burned building into a furnished studio apartment in a different neighborhood about 20 minutes away. I went to see it with Lucille the next morning, and it was small and impersonal with generic furniture and white walls, but the smoke detectors were new and clearly visible on the ceiling. I walked through the whole apartment checking every safety feature, and the building had a modern sprinkler system with heads in every room. I stood in the middle of the empty studio and felt this weird mix of relief and loss, because everything I owned had been destroyed in the fire. The building manager handed me a list of donated clothes and basic supplies available through victim services, and I realized I was literally starting over with nothing. No photos, no books, no personal items that made a space feel like mine. Even my laptop and all my schoolwork were gone, just ash and smoke damage. Lucille helped me sign the paperwork and told me this was temporary until I could find something more permanent, but the displacement felt like another layer of loss piled on top of everything else. I moved in that afternoon with 2 bags of donated clothes and a box of basic supplies, and spent the first hour checking every smoke detector battery and making sure all the windows opened properly for emergency exits. I started outpatient pulmonary therapy the following week, going to the hospital twice a week for sessions with a respiratory therapist named Maria. She was patient and encouraging, teaching me breathing exercises and techniques to manage my reduced lung capacity. We started with simple things like pursed lip breathing and diaphragm strengthening, and she explained that my lungs had been damaged by the smoke and the minutes I spent dying on that hallway floor. The progress was slow and frustrating in ways I hadn't expected. Simple activities like walking up the stairs to my second-floor apartment left me winded and gasping, and carrying groceries from my car required multiple breaks. Maria kept telling me I was doing well and making progress, but I could feel how my body worked differently now. I had to plan my days around my energy levels, resting between activities that used to be automatic. Taking a shower required sitting down halfway through, and I couldn't talk on the phone while walking anymore because I didn't have enough breath for both. Maria taught me to pace myself and recognize my limits, but accepting that my body was permanently changed felt like grieving another loss. I was alive because of Thomas, but the person who survived wasn't quite the same person who went into that fire. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse hallway with Detective Lewis while Lincoln testified before the grand jury. We weren't allowed in the room during his testimony, so I just waited on the hard wooden bench and watched the clock. My hands were sweating, and I kept checking my inhaler was in my pocket even though I'd already checked it 5 times. Lincoln was inside for almost 2 hours before the door finally opened, and he walked out looking pale and shaken. He saw me sitting there and came over slowly, his hands shoved in his pockets. Detective Lewis stepped away to give us a moment, and Lincoln stood in front of me, not quite meeting my eyes. He told me he was sorry for not doing more to help that night, that he'd been drunk and scared and just followed Jenny's lead. His voice was quiet and he looked genuinely upset, but I also felt this anger sitting in my chest because sorry doesn't change what happened. I told him I was grateful he was telling the truth now, even though I was still angry he stood by while Jenny left me to die. Lincoln nodded and said he understood, and that testifying was the least he could do to make things right. Detective Lewis came back over after he left and told me his testimony went well, that he'd been clear and consistent about everything he witnessed. She seemed optimistic that the grand jury would indict on all charges, and I felt this small spark of hope that maybe the legal system would actually work. 2 days later, Mrs. Chen visited me at my temporary apartment carrying a small wooden box. She was in her 80s with white hair and shaking hands, and she told me the police had returned some of her jewelry from evidence. She opened the box to show me a gold necklace and 2 rings that had belonged to her late husband, and her eyes filled with tears as she talked about how much those pieces meant to her. We sat at my small kitchen table and she made us tea, and she told me stories about her husband who died 15 years ago, and how each piece of jewelry marked a different anniversary or special occasion. She talked about being terrified during the fire, trying to grab important things but mostly just getting herself out safely. Learning that Jenny had stolen from her during the evacuation had shaken her faith in people, and I could see how much the betrayal hurt her. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and held my hand, thanking me for reporting what happened and helping her get some of her treasures back. I felt the weight of what Jenny took from both of us, and it wasn't just the physical property. Jenny had stolen our sense of safety and trust in the world, making us both question whether we could rely on other people during emergencies. Mrs. Chen stayed for almost 2 hours, and when she left, she hugged me tight and told me I was brave for telling the truth. Detective Lewis called me the next week with news I'd been dreading but expecting. The DA's office had decided not to pursue any homicide-related charges connected to Thomas's death. The detective explained that the legal causation was too indirect, that they couldn't prove Jenny's lie directly caused Thomas to go back into the building. She said they'd argued about it internally, but the legal standards were too high, and the defense could create too much reasonable doubt. I sat on my couch listening to her explain the legal reasoning, and I felt this crushing sense of failure, even though Detective Lewis kept saying this wasn't unexpected. Jenny wasn't going to be held accountable for the death that resulted from her actions, and that felt like the biggest injustice of everything that happened. Thomas died because he went back up to check a floor Jenny said was clear, and legally that wasn't her fault somehow. Detective Lewis's voice was gentle as she reminded me the legal system has limits, and some wrongs can't be fully addressed through criminal charges. I understood what she was saying, but it didn't make the anger and disappointment any easier to process. Thomas gave his life to save me, and Jenny would never face consequences for the lie that put him in that position. Callista brought up civil action during our next therapy session, explaining that criminal cases and civil claims were separate processes. She helped me understand that even if the criminal case didn't result in the outcomes I wanted, I could potentially pursue Jenny for damages in civil court. I met with a victims' rights attorney the following week for a free consultation, and she outlined what I could potentially recover for medical expenses, stolen property, and emotional distress. The attorney was realistic about the challenges, warning me that collecting any judgment would be difficult if Jenny didn't have significant assets or income. She explained that civil cases require a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, but they also take years and cost money I didn't have. I asked about contingency arrangements and she said my case might qualify, but she wanted to see how the criminal case resolved first. I decided to wait until after the criminal trial to pursue civil options, focusing my energy on one legal battle at a time. The attorney gave me her card and told me to call after the criminal case concluded, and I left her office feeling both hopeful about future options and overwhelmed by how long this whole process would take. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number 2 weeks later, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking. The message was from Jenny, clearly sent from a burner phone to get around the protective order. She wrote that she never meant for things to go this far and asked if we could work this out privately. The text was this weird mix of apology and threat, saying she understood I was hurt, but that pressing charges was going to ruin both our lives. I took screenshots immediately, my fingers fumbling on the phone screen, and forwarded everything to Detective Lewis without responding. The detective called me back within an hour and told me she was documenting the violation and notifying the court. Jenny's bail conditions were modified to include electronic monitoring, and Detective Lewis explained that violating a protective order was serious, and showed Jenny still didn't understand the severity of what she'd done. I felt this surge of anger that Jenny thought she could just text me and make this all go away, like leaving me to die was something we could work out privately between friends. The violation actually strengthened my resolve to see the criminal case through no matter how long it took or how exhausting the process became. Jenny had shown me exactly who she was that night in the fire, and every action since then just confirmed it. 6 weeks after the fire, I signed a lease on a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a newer building across town. It cost more than I could easily afford on my limited income, but the safety features were worth the financial strain. The building had monitored smoke detectors that connected to a central system, a modern sprinkler system throughout, multiple exits on every floor, and security cameras in all the common areas. I walked through the apartment 3 times before signing the lease, checking every window lock and testing every smoke detector. The landlord probably thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I needed to know I was safe. I moved in with my donated furniture and basic supplies and spent the first night checking every lock 3 times and keeping my phone and inhaler on the nightstand within easy reach. I couldn't sleep for the first few hours, listening to every sound and imagining smoke alarms going off. But eventually I dozed off and slept better than I had since the fire, knowing I was in a secure space with working safety systems. The apartment was small and plain, but it was mine, and every smoke detector and sprinkler head made me feel like I could finally breathe again. A few days after moving in, My phone rang while I was unpacking donated kitchen supplies. Margaret's name showed on the screen, and I answered immediately, sitting down on my secondhand couch. She told me the fire department was giving Thomas a special medal for what he did that night. The Medal of Valor, they call it. And the ceremony would include talking about how he heard me banging on the floor after someone said the building was empty. Her voice shook when she asked if I would come as her guest, and I said yes, even though the idea of being in front of that many people made my chest feel tight. The medal felt important not just because Thomas deserved it, but because it was official proof that someone lied and he died fixing that lie. Margaret gave me the date and time, 3 weeks away, and I marked it on my phone calendar with hands that trembled slightly. 2 weeks later, I met Margaret at a small Italian restaurant near her house, the kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. We ordered pasta and garlic bread, and for the first hour we just talked about Thomas as a regular person, not a hero. Margaret told me about his awful dad jokes that made their daughters groan, how he spent every Saturday morning fishing at the lake even when he never caught anything, how proud he was when both girls graduated college. She cried a little talking about him, and so did I, and we both agreed that the grief wasn't something that would ever completely go away, but we were learning to carry it. Then Margaret reached across the table and took my hand, looking me right in the eyes. She said she didn't blame me for what happened to Thomas, that he made his own choice to go back up those stairs because that's who he was. Hearing her say those words out loud felt like something tight and painful in my chest suddenly loosened, and I could breathe deeper than I had in weeks. I walked home from Margaret's house as the sun was setting, the early evening air cool against my face. My inhaler sat in my right pocket, and a printed copy of my original police statement sat in my left, both reminding me that I survived and I told the truth. Detective Lewis had warned me the criminal case against Jenny would take months, maybe even a year, to work through courts and lawyers and all that legal stuff. I accepted that justice might not look the way I wanted it to, that it might be messy and incomplete instead of satisfying. But I was building something new now, a life based on being safe and honest and surrounding myself with people like Margaret and Detective Lewis and Callista and Lucille, who actually showed up when things got hard. Thomas gave me another chance at living by refusing to believe Jenny's lie about the empty floor, by trusting what he heard instead of what he was told. I honored that gift every day by keeping my promise to tell the truth even when it was scary or difficult, trusting that speaking up was right no matter how the legal system ended up handling everything. My new apartment building came into view and I pulled out my keys, ready to go inside and keep building this second chance at life one honest day at a time. Well, that's the big finish, underwhelming as it might be. If you've stuck around, you clearly don't mind questionable content. Go on, subscribe, and make it official. At this point, you're in too deep.